Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, all you smart, sharp, analytical people who are members of the inner circle of tiers 2 and 3 of this podcast, and listeners, therefore, to the BungaCast Reading Club. Welcome. This is the final edition of the 2023 Reading Club. Apologies, we're a little bit late. We started it all a little bit late. It's kind of shifted over. But anyway, so this is the last one of 2023. We're going to revamp things a bit for 2024, along with a whole bunch of other revamps. That's to be announced soon. Keep an eye out. I'm going to keep trailing it until I actually have concrete news to give. But things will change, and it'll be exciting and fun. So keep an eye out for that. But that also means that the reading club will change a little bit. This will be announced in due course. So this is a way of concluding our 2023 syllabus, where we talked about freedom, mortality, secularism in the first third of the year, and then we moved on to questions of crisis and legitimacy in the middle part, and now we're talking about imperialism, international relations, and China's rise. So this is, because it's the last episode of the year, you'll notice that we're doing episodes kind of 3 and 4 combined. We're doing the whole last part, second half of the book of Adam Smith in Beijing, Lineages of the 21st Century by Giovanni Arrighi, as a way of concluding this. And, it's a book about China's rise, written in, published in 2008. So there's lots to reflect on in terms of what has happened in the interim, but it's also a kind of a nice way to round this out because it's forward looking. Whatever else happens, China's going to be there. With that platitude out of the way, Phil.
Hey, thanks, Alex. So, as Alex mentioned, it is the last of our old model reading club, and the second part of this book. And I think, it's not just the appeal of the book, for me at least, and I think part of the rationale for choosing it is not just the fact of the centrality it gives to China, but also the fact that so much of the argument hinges around the relative decline of the US. And that is very much, obviously, kind of very much being talked about now as the US, as we're talking now. The US is notoriously struggling to supply both Ukraine and Israel at the same time. It's two close allies that are embroiled in their own regional conflicts. And so all that discussion of the decline of the US is very palpable at the moment, alongside the far more significant role of China in the global economy now compared to when Arrighi wrote the book back in 2007. I suppose the other thing is that's also part of it is that the intervening period between now and then also saw, and this is something we'll talk about in a bit more detail because I think it is actually a useful historical corrective, I suppose, to some of the contemporary discussion. But Arrighi was writing at the time of the just before the US election that would come and sweep Barack Obama to power. And Obama kind of was perhaps the last the last blast of sunshine on the peak, I think, of US unipolar liberalism before the sun set, if I can put it in slightly portentous terms, looking back. But I want to talk a bit about that, about how far the intervening period of the Obama years has, how that affects the argument and how that affects our kind of retrospective assessment of the left, I suppose, and also US decline, if the US is indeed declining. Okay, so with that throat clearing out of the way, what we're going to do is we're talking through part 3 first. And what I want to do is just briefly summarize some of the material from the relevant chapters before, as we've done previously, before extracting some of the themes I want to talk about more. And as with before, if readers feel that there's anything that we haven't paid sufficient attention to in the discussion, by all means, readers, I say readers and listeners, by all means, feel free to to let us know, and we'll try and come back to it.
They are readers too. This is the reading club.
Yes, readers and listeners. Thank you, Alex. And then we'll come back to it in the Alpha bonus. So part 3 is hegemony unraveling. And it's again divided into 3 chapters. And essentially it's looking at the decline of, it's the centerpiece of the book with respect to the thesis on US power. And as the first chapter in that section, Domination Without Hegemony, implies, it's mainly hinged around using the Iraq invasion for the idea that American hegemony is over because it's being substituted with the use of direct force, with all the kind of consequent reverberations in terms of expenditure of effort, costs to US empire, but also the alienation that it precipitated among both allies and in the global south, for want of a better term. So Domination Without Hegemony is, I suppose, Arrighi's summation of the Iraq invasion. The use of military force was a sign of the weakening of American hegemony. And he talks through it. He talks about how the how the invasion, at least the first Gulf War, was intended to exercise the specter of Vietnam, the defeat for US empire by a popular guerrilla insurgency in the south. And that this pattern seemed to repeat, or the specter of Vietnam wasn't exercised, in fact, by the Gulf War of the early 1990s, not least because Saddam Hussein wasn't thrown out of power. And so there was the need for the return, and that essentially the terror attacks of 2001 provided the pretext for this expenditure of military power. He talks through it in some detail, and particularly I think it's in terms of being a short summary of the failures of the American war efforts in Iraq, it's excellent. It's not especially drawn out or complicated, but in terms of talking about the failures of counterinsurgency, the brittleness of the US effort, and the fact that they were fighting an enemy that was far weaker and more fragmented and less technologically sophisticated than the Viet Cong, which is to say the Iraqi insurgency. All of that is to underscore the hollowness of American power in this period. And also, it is, one of the sections in the chapter, and again, it's kind of fascinating to look at, given this is something that's still being, very much being talked about now with the regional fragmentation of the global economy. But he talks about the strange death of the globalization project. And he talks through this with the Bush administration in particular. And this is something I want to come back to because it's something that is easy to forget from our point of view today. But the reaction to the Bush and the unhinged character of the reaction to the Bush administration in that period, even before the launch of the war on terror and the terror attacks of September 2001, it kind of shadowed or prefigured Trumpism, and it's something we've picked up on in some of the previous discussion. But I wanted to return to it because Arrighi addresses it most directly here. So this is it talks. It combines a discussion of American military failures in Iraq with the political economy of the time, including the rise of China, as well as talking through some of Arrighi's, I suppose, what he considers to be his fellow travelers. And there's this odd, and again, this is something I want to return to, but there's long, I think, been, particularly among the Marxists associated with the New Left Review, a kind of an interesting and revealing in some ways, I think, reverence for US realists, and particularly John Mearsheimer. So Arrighi is effusive in his praise of John Mearsheimer's book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And Mearsheimer is someone he comes back to, and Mearsheimer is still very much a kind of even more so, a more prominent public figure now than he was back then. Back then, he was famously a critic of the Iraq War from the perspective of U.S. national interests, and he's still a critic of American foreign policy, both with its support of Israel in Gaza, but also even more so over Ukraine. So there is this odd kind of affinity between Marxists such as Arrighi and Mearsheimer, who, despite on the surface, there would seem to be little kind of political or theoretical resonances between a world systems theorist so deeply rooted in Marxian approaches to political economy and a theorist rooted in purely kind of security dynamics at the international level. And so, anyway, it's something which is curious, I think, and worth talking about. Chapter 8 is he talks through his reconstitution of a Marxist theory of imperialism, drawing heavily on David Harvey's idea of the spatial and temporal fix that capitalism goes through in Harvey's reckoning. He also talks a bit about he talks or develops more some of Harvey's ideas, including the idea of accumulation by dispossession, the use of state power to achieve certain to prop up and maintain a capitalist accumulation through the direct use of state violence and force rather than through this operation and logic of the market. And so this is, it's a fairly conventional, I think, for the most part, Harveyite account of imperialism in this period. And David Harvey's theory of imperialism was enormously influential at the time of the Iraq invasion. Arrighi qualifies it in some respects. He kind of emphasizes his own deeper historical perspective. He kind of introduces some of Hannah Arendt's political theory as an appropriate complement to the idea of capital accumulation as this endless and limitless process that requires similar kind of logics of infinite power accumulation. And the two things kind of parallel each other. So he develops some of that, but that aside, it's a fairly straightforward account of Harveyite theories of imperialism, and it would be familiar, I think, to, I presume, plenty of our listeners and readers. And then the next chapter, the final chapter in this section, and I think in some ways the most kind of intellectually intriguing, particularly for me at least. And maybe that just reflects my own intellectual interest, or perhaps others will agree with me. But it's the idea of the world state that never was. And here he kind of puts forward this thesis that the American state is in different moments itself the proto-form of a world state, or that by virtue of its sheer kind of stupendous military might and economic power, that it's been thrust forward into being the kind of paradigmatic form of a world state. And this, I think, is kind of genuinely genuinely fascinating proposition. And even if it's something which can only be kind of broached tentatively and teasingly, I think, or it's very tantalizing, some of the thoughts that Arrighi develops and perhaps doesn't go far enough with, I think, in this chapter. It's something, even if it doesn't have any kind of clear political upshot, I think it's an intriguing premise. The idea that we're kind of trapped in some kind of historical antechamber between the beginnings of a world state and the inability to actually realize that political project on the scale that's necessary. It's a fascinating kind of proposition, and one I think that's worth drawing out a bit more. So before we talk a bit more, before we kind of slice a bit more deeply into some of the content and extract some of the themes I wanted to talk about, I wondered if you guys had anything to add onto a few more adornments, perhaps, to the skeleton I've just set up.
Yeah, I can have a go at adorning that skeleton a little. One thing, or I don't know if either of you have seen Generation Kill, this David Simon TV show.
No, I know the
Shaking-
one. I never watched it for some reason. Actually, it's a good point.
I had this recommended, albeit after a few glasses of wine, by a listener who said it was the best thing on TV they'd ever seen, and so watched this fairly recently, and it is brilliant. It is a really fantastic account of the. You have these kind of reconnaissance Marines kind of going through Iraq and sort of. I won't give too much away. Not that there's all that much of a plot, but it just captures the kind of, I don't know, the disorganization and the kind of the pointlessness and just they didn't have a plan. Like it really kind of, it doesn't make these points too explicitly, and it's got great characters, and that's why it's good. But it just made me think, like, this is the kind of the counterpart of this. I mean, I think this is the best part maybe of the whole book, this part 3, Hegemony Unraveling. And because I think it's the most kind of important thing in a way that he deals with. There's a lot of the longer term historical things, but this is the real crux of it, like his model of, what is hegemony and how is that like underlain by all these kind of political economy and kind of global politics factors. This is the meat, I think, of a lot of it, because it's kind of the US decline and understanding why that happens and what the consequences are going to be. So yeah, I think it was a really, there's obviously a lot more to talk about with the project for the New American Century and what actually happened in Iraq. But I think, yeah, it was, I think my favorite part of the book for what that's worth.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I also thought it was my favorite part of the book, not least because it's a book that is challenging insofar as it brings together lots of different themes, quite divergent, and does quite deep dives into each of them, and has an argument in each of the parts. And then, maybe we can come to this at the end when we evaluate the book a bit. But, it's a question as to how well the argument as a whole fits together, because he's doing all these different things. He's doing kind of classical political economy and the theory of, Adam Smith in the first part. And then he's talking about the economics of global turbulence and crisis and the notions of hegemony in the second part. And then, the third part, as George has just mentioned. And then there's also the stuff about, Chinese ascent in the fourth part, which we're going to come to at the second part of this episode. So I almost feel like taking bits from the parts. I'm not sure how much I'm going to take from the book as a whole. We'll come to that anyway. Well, hello, listener. I hope you like what you're hearing. It's a short excerpt from an episode that's available only to subscribers. Want to support BungaCast and get at least 2 original episodes a month? Sign up at patreon.com/BungaCast right now. $5 a month patrons get access to exclusive episodes like our in-depth analyses of present history. The big stuff that's happening right now. As well as chats with our regular guests, extended interviews with the key thinkers trying to understand our world today, and much more. For $10 a month, you join the BungaCast Reading Club, the place for those of us who are serious about equipping ourselves with the necessary intellectual tools for understanding the world and seeking to change it. Phil, George, and myself, Alex, look forward to seeing you there. Patreon.com/BungaCast.